The sound of that ceramic statue shattering on the town square's pavement. For 30 years, that was the only prayer I ever offered. I was the one who did it. My name is Elias. I'm 62 years old now, but this happened not so long ago. My hands, calloused and stained from a lifetime of woodworking, were the instruments of a bitterness so deep it had turned my soul to stone. It was our town's annual Founders' Day parade, a day meant for celebration, for community. But I had no community. Not anymore. Right there, in front of everyone, my sister, my neighbors, the children, I was the one who walked straight up to the flowered litter, carrying the town's cherished statue of the Virgin Mary, tore it from its place, and held it high. For just a moment, a terrible, silent moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then I threw it down. The crack it made echoed louder than any church bell. I saw the silent scream on my sister Martha's face, the way the blood drained from Father Michael's as if he'd been struck himself. I saw the stunned, dead silence of the people who had known me my entire life. This wasn't some sudden impulse, some drunken mistake. This was a declaration. It was the final, bitter sentence in a long, one-sided argument with a silent sky that I blamed for everything. I grew up in this town. I learned to work wood in my father's shop, the same one I still use today. The scent of pine and oak sawdust is the scent of my entire life. I was raised in the church, went to Sunday school, knew all the hymns by heart. But faith, for me, was like a piece of furniture, was just there, in the room. It wasn't something I felt in my bones. Then I met Sarah. She was everything. Her faith wasn't furniture. It was the sunlight that came through the windows. It was warm and real, and it made everything it touched more beautiful. She loved that little plaster statue. She'd say a prayer to it every morning, leaving a wildflower at its base when she could. I used to tease her about it. "You're talking to a doll, Sarah," I'd say. She'd just smile that smile of hers and say, "I'm not talking to the plaster, Elias. I'm talking to the mother." I didn't get it, but I loved that she did. When she got sick, that's when the cracks in my own foundation began to show. We prayed, oh, how we prayed. Martha brought over prayer chains. Father Michael held special services. Sarah, even as she got weaker, never lost that light. But I did. With every prayer that went unanswered, a little piece of me grew colder, harder. When I lost her, the silence in our house was a physical thing. It was a weight. The sunlight she loved so much just seemed to highlight the dust in the air, and my grief, it curdled. It turned into a poison that seeped into every corner of my life. My sister Martha, bless her heart, she tried. She'd drag me to potluck dinners in the church basement, where people would pat my arm and say, "She's in a better place." I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to ask them what place could possibly be better than right here, with me. Every sermon Father Michael gave on acceptance, on God's mysterious plan, felt like a personal accusation. It felt like they were telling me my pain was a failure of faith. And in a way, they were right. I had no faith left. All I had was a burning, white-hot anger. And I aimed it all at the symbols they held so dear. I'd see the rosary beads hanging from someone's rearview mirror, and I'd scoff. I'd hear a hymn, and it would sound like a mockery. That statue of the Virgin Mary became the focal point of all my rage. To me, it was the face of the silent heaven that had ignored my pleas. It was the symbol of the simple, easy faith that I believed had been stolen from me, or worse, had never been real at all. Sarah had loved it, and now it stood there, perfect and serene, while she was gone. The injustice of it ate me alive. So, on that Founders' Day, when I saw it coming down the street, held aloft on a bed of roses, something inside me snapped. Years of silent resentment, of choked-back tears and clenched fists, finally found their voice. And that voice was the sound of shattering ceramic. I wanted them all to feel a fraction of the brokenness I felt every single day. If God wouldn't listen to my pain, I would make his followers stare at it, right there on the pavement, in 1,000 pieces. I stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, my heart pounding with a grim and terrible satisfaction. I had finally made the world as ugly on the outside as I felt on the inside. This was the man I was. This was the bottom. If this story, this confession, has touched something in you, if you're willing to hear how a man this broken could possibly find his way back, I would be truly grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and like this video. It lets me know that my story is being heard. And please, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It helps me to know that I'm not just talking into the void, to know who is out there, listening to this old woodworker's testimony. Now, let me tell you what happened next. After I left the town square, I didn't go home. I went to my workshop. It's a separate building behind the house, my own little kingdom of sawdust and solitude. The silence in there was different that day. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a finished project. It was the dead air of a tomb. I had the pieces with me. In a canvas bag, I'd scooped up the larger shards of the statue from the pavement. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted a trophy. A reminder of my great victory over a piece of plaster. I dumped them out on my workbench, the clatter of the ceramic pieces echoing in the cavernous space. They looked pathetic. Not like a symbol of defeated faith, but like trash. Just broken, painted junk. The grim satisfaction I'd felt in the square, that brief, hot surge of power, had already cooled, leaving behind a grey, ashen emptiness. I sat on my stool, the one my father had used, its wood smoothed and worn by decades of work, and I just stared. The phone in the house didn't ring. I expected my sister Martha to call, screaming, crying, anything. I expected Father Michael to call with condemnation. I expected angry neighbors, threats, something. But there was nothing. Just the hum of the old bandsaw in the corner and the slow ticking of the wall clock, each second landing like a drop of water on stone. The silence from the town was worse than any shouting could have been. It was a verdict. I had finally done it. I had pushed everyone away so completely that they didn't even have words for me anymore. I was an outcast, declared and confirmed by my own hand. I tried to summon the old anger, the familiar, comforting rage that had been my only companion since Sarah died. I thought of the platitudes, the gentle smiles, the hymns. I tried to feel that righteous fire again, to tell myself they had it coming, that their blind faith was an insult to real suffering, to my suffering. But the words were hollow. The fire was out. There was nothing left to burn. That's when the shaking started. It began in my hands, these hands that could carve a perfect dovetail joint or coax a story from a block of wood. Now, they trembled like a leaf in the wind. I couldn't stop them. The tremor moved up my arms, into my chest, until my teeth were chattering. It wasn't the cold. The evening was mild. It was a chill coming from the inside out. A deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the weather. I tried to stand up, maybe make some coffee, do something normal, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was pinned to that stool, a prisoner in my own body. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the edges of my vision blurring, the familiar shapes of my tools turning into dark, menacing smudges. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm, like a trapped bird beating against a cage. I thought, this is it. This is a heart attack. After all my railing against a silent heaven, I was going to die alone on the dusty floor of my workshop, surrounded by the shards of a cheap statue. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh, but the sound that came out was a strangled gasp. I couldn't breathe. It felt like a giant fist was wrapped around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I slumped forward, my head on the workbench, right next to the broken pieces. The sharp edge of a shard pressed against my cheek, and in that moment, all the pride, all the anger, all the years of self-pity and blame just collapsed. It wasn't a heart attack. It was something worse. It was the complete and total failure of the man I had built myself to be. My foundation of rage, the very thing I thought made me strong, had crumbled to dust, and I was in a freefall. The fear was absolute. Not just of dying, but of the vast, terrifying emptiness that I had mistaken for strength. I had spent so long shouting into a void, and now I had finally become the void myself. There was nothing there. No God, no devil, no Sarah, not even the ghost of the man I used to be. Just a lonely, frightened old man, suffocating in the silence he had created. If you've ever felt a loneliness that deep, a silence that loud, you know it's a place from which it feels like there's no return. If this story is speaking to you, please let me know by giving it a like, and be sure to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happened to me next, in the deepest part of that darkness. I was lying there, cheek pressed against the rough, splintery surface of my workbench, the smell of sawdust and my own stale sweat filling my lungs. Each breath was a ragged, shallow thing. The world had shrunk to the space of that dusty bench, to the sharp edge of a ceramic shard digging into my skin. This was it, the end of the line. The great, defiant Elias, brought down not by a bolt of lightning from an angry God, but by the pathetic collapse of his own heart, alone in the dark. The silence in the workshop was absolute. Not a cricket, not a passing car. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, that makes you hear the blood pounding in your own ears. And then, something changed. It wasn't a sound, it was the light. The weak moonlight that filtered through the grimy window pane, usually just enough to cast long, skeletal shadows of my tools on the wall, seemed to shift. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I thought the lack of oxygen was making me see things. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. And it was still there. No, it was growing. A light was coming from the pile of broken ceramic on my bench. It wasn't a fire, it wasn't a reflection. It was a soft, warm glow, like the first light of dawn seeping through a thick canopy of old-growth pines. It was gentle, golden, and it pulsed with a soft, living rhythm, like a slow heartbeat. My first thought was that I'd finally gone mad. The grief, the anger, the years of isolation, they had finally snapped something in my brain. This was a hallucination, a final, flickering image from a dying mind. I tried to tell myself that I tried to anchor myself to the solid, rational world. I knew the world of wood grain and sharp steel, of physics and predictable outcomes. But the light grew stronger, and as it did, the bone-deep chill that had seized me began to recede. It was a physical warmth, seeping into my skin, chasing away the tremors in my hands. It wasn't just illuminating the workshop, it was filling it. The menacing shadows of the saws and lathes softened, their hard edges dissolving in this gentle radiance. And in the heart of the light, right there among the shattered pieces of the thing I had destroyed, a form began to take shape. It wasn't a terrifying apparition. There was no thunder, no booming voice. It was a woman. Her form was woven from the light itself, serene and solid, yet translucent. I could see the grain of the workbench through her. She wasn't wearing a crown of gold or robes of brilliant blue like in the church paintings. She was simple, her expression etched not with divine judgment, but with a sorrow so deep, so profound, it made my own lifetime of grief feel like a child's tantrum. Her eyes, they met mine, and in them I saw no condemnation for what I had done. There was no anger for my blasphemy, no disgust for the hatred that had poisoned my soul. There was only a shared, bottomless understanding, a compassion that I had never known was possible. She didn't speak, not with her lips, but a thought, a question, bloomed in my mind with more clarity than any spoken word. It wasn't my thought. It was hers, placed there gently, without force. Do you think I don't know the agony of watching the one you love die? That question, it didn't just break the silence, it broke me. The entire fortress of rage I had spent years building, stone by bitter stone, crumbled into dust in that single, silent moment. My anger had been built on the lie that my pain was singular, that my suffering was unheard, that heaven was a cold, indifferent place. But the gaze of this mother, this being of light and sorrow, told me a different truth. She knew, she had stood at the foot of a cross. She had known the ultimate loss. My pain was not dismissed, it was shared. The dam inside me burst. A sob, raw and ugly, tore its way out of my throat. And then another and another. For the first time since Sarah died, I wept. I didn't weep for myself. I wept for the man I had become. I wept for the hate I had nurtured like a precious flame. I wept for the years I had wasted, shouting at a heaven that was not silent, but was weeping with me all along. I collapsed off the stool onto my knees on the dusty floor, my face in my hands, and I cried until there was nothing left inside me but a vast, aching emptiness, cleansed and raw. Slowly, the light began to fade, receding back into the ceramic shards until the workshop was once again filled with the dim, grey moonlight. The presence was gone, but the silence that returned was different. It wasn't an empty, oppressive silence anymore. It was peaceful. It was full. I stayed there on my knees for I don't know how long, my breath catching in my chest, the floorboards cold beneath me. And then I heard a sound. A soft, hesitant knock on the workshop door. It was so unexpected it made me jump. I slowly, painfully, got to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. I opened the door, expecting to see Father Michael or the town sheriff. But it was my sister, Martha. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes red-rimmed. She wasn't holding a Bible or a lecture. She was holding an old thermos and a woolen blanket. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw the light on. I was worried. I brought you some soup." And in that simple, human gesture, in that moment of undeserved kindness after all I had done, I felt the truth of the vision echo in the real world. It was a confirmation. It was mercy, handed to me in a thermos cup. If you've ever felt a moment where a simple act of kindness felt like a message from heaven, please let me know by giving this video a like, and be sure to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what I did with those broken pieces. That soup Martha brought was the first thing I'd eaten in a day. I sat at my kitchen table, the old oak one my father had built, and I drank it right from the thermos. It was lukewarm, but it felt like the warmest meal of my life. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the dark, watching the moon crawl across the sky, replaying the vision in my mind. Over and over. By the time the sun came up, casting long, familiar shadows across the floor, I had almost convinced myself it was a dream, a hallucination. That's what it had to be, right? I was a man in his 60s, under immense stress, who had committed a terrible act of public defiance. My mind, riddled with guilt and grief, had simply snapped. It manufactured a comforting illusion, a psychological self-defense mechanism. The light, a passing car's headlights, refracting through the dusty window. The warmth, a psychosomatic response. The voice, the question. My own subconscious, pulling memories from a childhood spent in Sunday school pews. It all made perfect, logical sense. I'm a woodworker. I believe in plumb lines and level surfaces, in the predictable nature of oak and pine. I believe in what I can measure and touch. And I couldn't touch this. But every time I settled on that rational, comforting explanation, the memory would come back, not as a dream, but as a fact. The feeling of that gaze. You can't invent a feeling that profound. The sorrow in her eyes was more real than the grain of the wood on my table. It wasn't a comforting illusion. It was devastating. It laid my soul bare. A comforting illusion would have told me I was right. It would have justified my anger. This did the opposite. It showed me my anger was a cheap, flimsy thing compared to true, divine sorrow. And then the shame began to creep in. It started as a small thing, a hot flush of embarrassment, but it grew with every passing hour. I remembered things I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered standing in this very kitchen, laughing at Sarah as she arranged wildflowers in a little vase to put by the statue. "You're talking to a doll," Sarah I'd said, my voice thick with a condescending affection I mistook for cleverness. I saw the small, patient smile she gave me, the one that said, "You don't understand, but that's okay." At the time, I thought I was the wise one. Now, the memory of my own smug ignorance made me feel physically ill. I remembered sitting in the church basement after she was gone, listening to my sister Martha talk about her prayer group. And I remembered the way I'd rolled my eyes, the heavy sigh I'd let out, making sure everyone knew how foolish I found their little rituals. I had weaponized my grief, using it as a club to beat down anyone who dared to offer me a comfort I didn't believe I deserved. I saw the hurt in Martha's eyes, a flicker of pain that I had been too proud and too selfish to even acknowledge. Each memory was a new stone laid on my chest. The man who had stood in that town square and shattered that statue wasn't a righteous man railing against injustice. He was a bully, a spiritual vandal, a coward who couldn't face his own pain, so he threw it at everyone else, hoping to make them hurt as much as he did. The battle in my own mind was more violent than any argument I'd ever had out loud. If you've ever fought a war inside yourself, please let me know by giving this video a like, and be sure to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the first step I took out of that trench. For a week, I was a ghost in my own life. I'd go to the workshop, pick up a tool, and then just stand there, lost in the war raging between my ears. My rational mind would scream, it was a trick of the light. Stress, old age, and then my heart, this broken, terrified thing I'd ignored for years, would whisper, but you know what you saw. You know what you felt. One night, I finally fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, and I dreamed of Sarah. It wasn't one of the old, painful dreams where she was sick and fading. In this dream, she was young again, the way she was when we first met. We were walking in a field, and she turned to me, her face full of that light she always carried, and she handed me a single white rose, perfect and unblemished. She didn't say a word, but her smile was all the acceptance in the world. I woke up with tears on my face, the scent of roses so strong in the room it was as if one was on the pillow next to me. That was the breaking point. Coincidence? A dream? Maybe. But I couldn't live in the space between anymore. I couldn't live with the man I had been. I had to do something. That evening, I walked out to my workshop, the place where my rage had been born and where it had died. The canvas bag with the broken pieces was still sitting in the corner where I'd kicked it. For a long moment, I just stared at it. This was the evidence of my crime, the symbol of my hatred. With trembling hands, I picked it up, carried it to my workbench, and emptied it. The shards clattered onto the wood, a pathetic pile of white and blue. I reached out and my fingers brushed against a piece. It was a fragment of the face. Just one eye, painted with a serene, downward gaze, and a small part of a gentle cheek. I picked it up. It felt cool and smooth in my calloused palm. I expected to feel the old anger, the familiar revulsion. I expected to feel nothing at all. But what I felt was the echo of that vision. The echo of that silent, compassionate sorrow. And I knew it was real. Kneeling on the dusty floor of my workshop for the second time, holding that broken piece of plaster like it was the most precious thing in the world, I closed my eyes. I didn't know the right words. I had forgotten them all. So I just said the only ones that were left in my heart. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the silence. "Oh God, I am so sorry." That apology, whispered on the dusty floor of my workshop, wasn't the end of the story. It was the first word of a new, terrifying, and beautiful chapter. The next morning, I didn't try to rationalize the vision away. I accepted it. I walked back to that workbench, laid out all the pieces of the shattered statue, and I began to work. Not with wood, but with glue and patience. It was a fool's errand. The ceramic was in 100 pieces. But with every tiny fragment I managed to fit back into place, I felt like I was mending a piece of my own soul. Of course, word gets around in a town like ours. It didn't take long for people to notice that the man who had so publicly destroyed the statue was now spending every waking hour trying to put it back together. The reactions were what you'd expect. Old Bill Hemlock, who runs the hardware store, saw me through the workshop window one afternoon. He just shook his head and muttered, "Lost his mind." Grief finally broke him. Some kids would ride their bikes past, yelling things, calling me crazy. I deserved it. I didn't blame them. The hardest part was the well-meaning folks, the ones who tried to reason with me. My own sister, Martha, came over, her face a mask of gentle concern. "Elias," she said, placing her hand on my arm, maybe you should talk to someone. What you went through, what you did, it was a trauma. Your mind could be playing tricks on you." I looked at her, my sister who had endured my scorn for so long, and I didn't get angry. I didn't try to convince her. I just said, "Martha, I know what it sounds like. But what happened in here that night was the most real experience of my life. More real than this workbench. More real than the sun in the sky." She didn't understand, not then. But she saw something in my eyes had changed. The fire was gone, but it wasn't replaced by embers. It was replaced by a quiet light. Still, I was an island. I had spent years building the walls, and now I didn't know how to tear them down. That's when Martha, in her infinite, stubborn grace, asked me to come with her. Not to church, to her little Tuesday night prayer group, the same one I used to mock, the one I called the Holy Rollers Club. I wanted to say no. The old pride, that familiar monster, rose up in my throat. But I looked at my hands, covered in ceramic dust and superglue, and I knew I couldn't do this alone. I sat in a circle of folding chairs in the church basement with 6 other people. They didn't stare, they didn't whisper. They just made room for me. And when it was my turn to speak, I didn't know what to say. So I just told them the truth. I told them everything. The anger, the bitterness, The shattering of the statue, the light, the vision, the silent question that broke me open. When I finished, the silence in that room was as profound as the silence in my workshop had been. I expected judgment. I expected them to tell me I was a blasphemer or a lunatic. Instead, a woman named Agnes, a grandmother whose hands were as gnarled as old tree roots, reached across the circle and took my hand. "Welcome home, brother," she said. And for the first time, I felt it. Community. That was the beginning. Putting the statue back together was impossible. It was too broken. It would always be a scarred, fragile thing. And in a way that felt right. It looked like me. But I knew it wasn't enough. My penance couldn't be just fixing what I had broken. It had to be creating something new. I went to Father Michael. I stood before him, the man whose face had gone white with shock as I committed my sin, and I asked for his forgiveness. And then I asked for a block of wood, the oldest, strongest piece of oak he could find in the church's stores. I told him I wanted to carve a new statue for the town, not to replace the old one, but to stand as a testament. He looked at me for a long time, and then he led me to a dusty corner of the belfry, where a massive, seasoned block of oak had been sitting for 100 years. For the next year, my workshop became a sanctuary. The sound of the mallet on the gouge was my prayer. Each curl of wood that fell to the floor was an offering. I wasn't just carving wood, I was carving away my own pride. I was shaping a new heart inside my own chest. I carved the lines of sorrow and compassion I had seen in her face. I carved the hands not in a gesture of judgment, but of offering. It was ready just before the next Founder's Day, a year to the day from my act of desecration. I stood before the entire town, in the same square, on the same spot where I had thrown down my hate. The new statue, carved from the heart of that ancient oak, stood beside me, veiled. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from a chill in my soul. It was from humility. I looked out at their faces, my neighbors, my friends, my sister, and I spoke. "A year ago," I said, my voice cracking, "I stood here, a broken and hateful man. I was so full of my own pain that I couldn't see anything else. And so I took my pain and I threw it at you. I threw it at this town. I threw it at God. I committed an act of violence because my heart was violent. I can never take that back. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness." I pulled the veil from the statue. A gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't a perfect, painted doll. It was a woman of substance, her face etched with a wisdom born of sorrow, her grain as real as the lines on a human hand. I hated this image, I continued, my voice thick with tears. I hated her because I thought she represented a faith that was easy and blind. But I was the one who was blind. On the worst night of my life, in the rubble of my own making, she was the one who came to me. The very thing I rejected was the only thing that had the mercy to pick me up off the floor. This isn't just a statue. This is my testimony. That there is no darkness so deep that the light cannot find you. That there is no heart so broken that it cannot be mended. That mercy is real, and it is a gift, especially for those of us who feel we least deserve it. My story isn't about becoming a perfect man. I'm still just a woodworker. But I'm a man who was shown a grace that makes no logical sense. I learned that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to listen in the silence. It's about letting your heart be changed. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in a mercy that can find us even when we're lost, please let me know by giving this video a like and hitting that notification bell. I'm sharing this because I believe these stories need to be told. And I want to ask you, in the comments below, Has there ever been a moment in your life where you felt a mercy you didn't earn? A moment of grace that changed everything? I would be honored to read your story. Thank you for listening.